The moment an avoidant loses feelings for you is not the moment they stop caring. It is the moment they finally feel safe enough to stop performing. Nobody tells you that. Everyone talks about the ick like it appears out of nowhere, like some switch flips inside a person and love turns to disgust in an instant. That is a lie sold to people who need a villain instead of an explanation. What actually happens is far stranger and far more revealing about the human mind than anyone wants to admit. There is a reason the withdrawal always seems to happen right after real intimacy begins. There is a reason it never happens during chaos, distance, or uncertainty. And there is a reason most avoidants cannot explain it themselves, because the truth is buried beneath a layer of the psyche that was built before they ever learned how to speak. What you are about to hear is not another theory about cold, broken people who cannot love. It is a map of what is actually happening inside the nervous system, the identity, and the deepest fears of a person the moment closeness starts to feel real. And once you understand it, you will never look at the ick the same way again. Every human being carries two separate systems of survival, and almost nobody realizes they are in constant conflict. One system wants connection because connection once meant survival for a creature that could not protect itself alone. The other system wants control because control once meant safety when connection could not be trusted. An avoidant is not a person who lacks the first system. An avoidant is a person whose second system was trained early and repeatedly to override the first one the moment it activates. This is the part almost nobody explains correctly. The withdrawal is not the absence of feeling, it is the presence of feeling at a volume the nervous system was never taught to tolerate. Consider what happens inside a child who learns, long before language, that needing someone leads to disappointment. That child does not conclude connection is bad. That child concludes connection is dangerous, specifically when it becomes necessary. This distinction changes everything about how avoidant psychology actually works. It explains why an avoidant can chase, pursue, and feel intensely drawn to someone during the early stages when nothing is guaranteed yet. It also explains why the same person can feel a wave of dread the moment the relationship becomes real, stable, or emotionally significant. The danger was never closeness itself. The danger was always dependence. Here is the first insight almost nobody discusses. The ick is not disgust toward the other person. It is disgust toward the version of themselves that is beginning to need someone. Watch closely and you will see it. The moment an avoidant catches themselves missing someone, checking for them, wanting them, a strange internal alarm goes off, and that alarm gets projected outward onto the partner because it is far less painful to find someone repulsive than to admit you have become emotionally dependent on them. This is not manipulation. It is misdirection created by a mind trying to protect itself from a threat it cannot name. Human beings are remarkably skilled at converting internal threats into external explanations. If a person cannot say, "I am terrified of how much I need you," that fear does not disappear. It transforms. It becomes, "Something about the way you laugh irritates me now." It becomes, "I do not know why, but I feel repelled." It becomes 1,000 small justifications that feel completely real in the moment because the mind requires a reason before it allows itself to retreat, and it will manufacture one rather than face the actual terror underneath. This is where most explanations of avoidant attachment stop, and this is exactly where the real psychology begins. Because underneath the fear of dependence lies something even more uncomfortable, something almost nobody wants to admit about themselves. The fear is not simply that the other person will leave. The fear is that the self, the avoidant's own identity, will dissolve inside the relationship and cease to exist as something separate and controllable. Attachment theorists call this engulfment, but that word is too clinical to capture what it actually feels like from the inside. It feels like drowning while everyone around you insists the water is warm and safe. Think about what identity actually is for a moment, because this matters more than it appears to. Identity, for most people, is built through boundaries. I am the person who does not need anyone. I am the person who stays composed. I am the person who cannot be hurt because I never let anyone close enough to hurt me. When intimacy deepens, those boundaries begin to blur, and for someone whose entire sense of self was constructed around control and independence, blurred boundaries do not feel romantic. They feel like an existential threat to the only identity they have ever trusted. Now here is where the story most people tell about avoidance completely breaks down, because it assumes only one person in this dynamic is struggling. The truth is more unsettling. The partner on the other side, often labeled the anxious one or the empath, is frequently doing something just as psychologically distorted without realizing it either. Many empaths do not simply love deeply, they regulate their entire nervous system through another person's presence. Their sense of safety, worth, and calm becomes outsourced to how connected the other person seems in that moment. This is not compassion. This is a different form of dependence wearing the costume of selflessness. Here is the second insight rarely spoken aloud. The empath is often not attracted to the avoidant despite their distance. They are unconsciously drawn to it because unpredictable closeness creates a stronger neurochemical response than stable closeness ever could. The brain releases dopamine most powerfully not when a reward is guaranteed, but when a reward is uncertain. An avoidant who pulls away and then returns is inadvertently creating one of the most addictive psychological patterns known to human behavior, and the empath is not weak for feeling pulled toward it. The empath is simply human, wired the same way a gambler is wired at a slot machine that occasionally pays out just enough to keep them seated. This means both people are, in different ways, addicted to the same unstable rhythm, but for entirely different reasons. The avoidant needs the withdrawal to survive the fear of losing self. The empath needs the pursuit to survive the fear of losing connection. Neither one is doing this to the other on purpose. Both are unconsciously recreating the exact emotional environment their nervous system learned to associate with love, long before either of them ever met. This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you because it means healing cannot begin with blaming the other person. It begins with recognizing the pattern was never really about them at all. The avoidant was never running from a specific partner. The avoidant was running from a version of intimacy that felt like annihilation. The empath was never simply loving a specific person too much. The empath was chasing a feeling of being chosen that could momentarily quiet an old, unrelated wound. Two separate histories collided and created something that looked like romance but functioned like a trauma reenactment neither person consciously designed. There is a harsher truth still waiting beneath this one, and it deserves to be said plainly. Most people who suddenly lose feelings are not actually falling out of love. They are falling out of tolerance for how exposed love makes them feel. Love did not disappear. Capacity did. And capacity, unlike feeling, can be rebuilt, but only by a person willing to sit inside discomfort instead of escaping through disgust, distance, or 100 quiet justifications designed to make leaving feel logical instead of frightening. Discomfort tolerance is the single most underrated psychological skill in the entire conversation about attachment, and almost nobody trains for it. People train for communication, people train for boundaries. Almost nobody trains for the simple, unglamorous discipline of staying present while an old fear screams that they should leave. This is not a communication problem. This is a nervous system that never learned how to sit still inside safety, because safety was never something it had enough practice recognizing. Picture a person who grew up in an environment where love arrived unpredictably, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, sometimes absent entirely without explanation. That person's nervous system did not learn love as a stable resource, it learned love as a threat assessment. Every time closeness increases, some quiet internal process begins scanning for the moment it will be taken away, because that is what the evidence of childhood taught it to expect. This is why stability itself can feel suspicious to someone who never had it. Calm does not register as safety. Calm registers as the silence before something goes wrong. This explains a pattern that confuses almost everyone who has loved an avoidant. The relationship can be going well, genuinely well, with no conflict, no red flags, no betrayal, and the withdrawal still happens anyway. People search desperately for a cause, convinced something must have gone wrong when the truth is far more uncomfortable. Sometimes the withdrawal happens precisely because nothing went wrong, because peace itself becomes unbearable to a mind that has never trusted peace to last. Here's the third insight, rarely discussed with any real depth. Many avoidants do not fear rejection nearly as much as they fear being fully known and still somehow found wanting. Rejection based on distance can be explained away. Rejection based on genuine intimacy cannot be. If someone gets close enough to see the real, unfiltered self, and that person eventually leaves anyway, there is no story left to protect the ego. This is why many avoidants unconsciously sabotage relationships right as they become deeply seen, because being fully known and later abandoned feels infinitely more devastating than never being known at all. Now widen the lens for a moment, because this pattern is not confined to romantic relationships. It shows up in how people approach ambition, creativity, friendship, and purpose. A person who fears being truly known by a partner often fears being truly known by their own potential as well. They will start projects and abandon them right before completion. They will chase goals and lose motivation the instant success becomes real instead of theoretical. The pattern is identical because the underlying architecture is identical. Closeness to anything meaningful, whether a person or a purpose, activates the same ancient alarm system that whispers, "Do not let this become real, because real things can be lost." This is where philosophy earns its place inside psychology, because Stoic thinkers understood something modern attachment theory is only beginning to rediscover. The things we fear losing the most are often the things we have refused to fully claim as our own. A person who never allows themselves to fully feel love cannot be devastated when love ends, because on some unconscious level, they never allowed themselves to fully have it. This is not cowardice in the way people usually mean the word. It is a form of self-protection so deeply ingrained that the person often has no idea they are practicing it. Consider the ancient idea that a person cannot lose what they never truly possessed. Avoidant withdrawal is, in many cases, an unconscious refusal to possess love completely, because full possession implies the terror of full potential loss. This is not weakness. It is a strategy, an old and exhausted strategy built by a younger version of that person who did not yet have the tools to survive heartbreak any other way. The tragedy is not that this strategy exists. The tragedy is that it continues running long after the danger that created it has disappeared. Here is where the empath's blind spot deserves equal attention, because this conversation cannot remain one-sided. Many empaths mistake intensity for depth, believing that the strength of their feelings proves the legitimacy of the connection. But intensity is not evidence of compatibility. Intensity is often evidence of unresolved longing being projected onto a person who merely resembles the shape of something the empath has been missing for a very long time. This is why empaths frequently describe feeling an inexplicable, overwhelming pull towards someone who is emotionally unavailable. The pull is real, but its true origin is rarely the specific person standing in front of them. There is a phrase worth sitting with for a moment. People do not fall in love with strangers. People fall in love with familiar emotional weather. If chaos, distance, and unpredictability felt like home during childhood, then stability can feel foreign, even boring, no matter how much a person consciously claims to want peace. This is why some empaths repeatedly choose avoidant partners, not because they enjoy suffering, but because their nervous system mistakes intensity for intimacy and mistakes anxiety for chemistry. The fourth insight, and perhaps the most uncomfortable one, is this. Neither person in this dynamic is actually seeing the other person clearly. The avoidant is often reacting to a symbolic threat built from childhood, not the actual partner standing in front of them. The empath is often chasing a symbolic rescue built from childhood, not the actual partner standing in front of them either. Two people can share a bed, a home, and years of memories, while both of them are, in some quiet unconscious sense, in a relationship with their own unresolved past. This is not meant to strip away the reality or meaning of genuine connection, because real connection can exist alongside these patterns. It simply means most people are not fighting with each other nearly as often as they believe. Most people are fighting old, invisible battles that happen to be wearing their partner's face. Healing does not begin with better communication techniques alone. Healing begins with the willingness to ask an uncomfortable question. What am I actually protecting myself from right now, and how old is that fear? Healing begins the moment a person stops asking why they were left and starts asking why leaving ever felt like the safer option. That single shift in questioning changes the entire trajectory of a person's emotional life, because blame keeps a person stuck in the past, while responsibility is the only force capable of moving them forward. This is not about excusing the pain caused by withdrawal, distance, or sudden disappearance. It is about understanding that pain deeply enough to finally stop reproducing it in every relationship that follows. Something rarely discussed in recovery from these patterns is the strange grief and avoidant experiences after healing begins. People assume healing feels only like relief, but for many avoidants, early healing feels like mourning a version of themselves that no longer exists. The armor they built was not just protection, it was identity. It was the story they told themselves about their own strength, independence, and self-sufficiency. Letting that armor soften does not feel triumphant at first. It feels like losing a familiar self, even if that self was quietly suffering the entire time. This is the fifth insight, and it deserves careful attention because almost nobody frames it this way. Many avoidants secretly fear that healing will make them ordinary. Their emotional distance often became tangled with a private sense of specialness, a belief that being unreachable made them mysterious, powerful, or above the vulnerability that seemed to consume everyone else. Softening into real intimacy can feel at first like losing that specialness, like becoming just another person capable of being hurt like anyone else. Nobody warns them that this fear is not weakness. It is ego mistaking invulnerability for strength, when true strength was always the ability to remain open despite the risk. Empaths carry a parallel and equally unspoken fear during their own healing process. Many quietly worry that if they stop over-giving, over-explaining, and over-functioning as the emotional engine of every relationship, they will become unlovable in their own right. Their identity often became fused with usefulness, with being the strong one, the understanding one, the person who holds everything together, even while quietly falling apart inside. Healing for an empath does not simply mean setting boundaries. It means confronting the terrifying possibility that they might be worthy of love, even when they are not endlessly giving, explaining, or accommodating. Here is a perspective almost never offered in relationship content, and it deserves to be stated with complete honesty. Sudden loss of feeling is not always evidence of avoidant attachment. Sometimes it is evidence of misalignment disguised as fear. Not every disconnect is trauma. Sometimes a relationship simply is not right, and the mind manufactures anxiety or distance as a way of avoiding the more painful admission that this particular connection was never meant to last. Confusing every ending with a wound to heal keeps people trapped in relationships that were never actually compatible, searching for a psychological explanation where a simple truth would suffice. The truth being, some connections end not because someone is broken, but because two people were never actually walking the same path. This distinction matters enormously because self-awareness without discernment becomes its own trap. A person can spend years analyzing their attachment style, healing their inner child, and doing the deep internal work, while still ignoring the plain, observable reality that a specific relationship simply does not function. Psychological insight is not meant to replace common sense. It is meant to sharpen it. The goal is never to explain away every ending with trauma language. The goal is to know the difference between fear creating distance and reality creating incompatibility. Now consider a harsher truth still, one that applies to both avoidants and empaths equally. Growth is not measured by how much a person understands their patterns, Growth is measured by how differently they behave the next time an old trigger appears. Insight without behavioral change is simply a more sophisticated form of staying stuck. A person can recite the psychology of attachment theory flawlessly and still withdraw the exact same way the next time intimacy deepens, because understanding a pattern intellectually and interrupting it in the actual moment of fear are two entirely different disciplines. This is where personal responsibility becomes unavoidable, and where most self-help content quietly fails people because it stops at explanation instead of demanding action. Understanding why the ick happens does not heal it. What heals it is the deliberate, uncomfortable practice of staying present the next time closeness starts to feel like too much, instead of retreating into disgust, distance, or manufactured justification. This requires something most people are not prepared for. It requires choosing discomfort on purpose repeatedly until the nervous system finally learns what it never learned in childhood, that closeness can exist without annihilation. There is a final layer to this conversation that connects everything discussed so far, and it reaches beyond romantic relationships entirely. The capacity to stay present through emotional intensity without collapsing into avoidance or over-attachment is not simply a relationship skill, it is a form of character. The ancient thinkers called this equanimity, the ability to remain steady regardless of the emotional weather passing through. This is not the absence of feeling, it is the presence of feeling without being ruled by it. A person who develops this capacity becomes someone entirely different in every area of their life, not only in love. They become someone who can pursue ambition without abandoning it the moment success feels real. They become someone who can build friendships without disappearing the moment those friendships require vulnerability. They become someone who can sit with uncertainty without needing to control, escape, or numb their way through it. This is the deeper transformation hiding underneath the entire conversation about avoidant attachment and the sudden loss of feeling. It was never only about relationships. It was always about the capacity to remain whole while fully present to something that matters. The truth stands in front of you now, and it can no longer be ignored. The ick was never proof that love disappeared. It was proof that fear arrived faster than courage could respond. Every time closeness begins to feel dangerous, a choice appears in that exact moment. The choice to retreat into an old familiar armor, or to stay and finally prove to your own nervous system that safety does not have to be followed by loss. This is not a lesson to admire from a distance. This is a discipline to practice today. The next time discomfort rises in a conversation, a text, or a quiet moment of real connection, notice the urge to pull away. Do not obey it instantly. Sit inside the discomfort for 60 more seconds than feels natural, because that is where healing actually happens, not in understanding but in staying. In the end, the people who transform are not the ones who stopped feeling fear. They are the ones who stopped letting fear make their decisions for them.